Hello everyone, and welcome to what is our last session of what's been an amazing cybersecurity showcase week. I hope you managed to join some of the session previously this week, and if not, they're all recorded. But for now, we're very excited to welcome you all back on the SA Bright Talk channel. And if this is your first time, it's great to have you here with us today. In today's webinar, we're going to examine how global cybersecurity threats are targeting supply chains to destabilize markets and individual organizations. And most importantly, we're going to look at what it takes to respond effectively. So my name is Benoit Hendricks. I'm one of the analysts here at the ISF, principal analyst in the research team. I work primarily these days on the SOGP, standard good practice, and I also worked quite a lot in supply chain. So very glad to be here today. And as you can see, we have two other speakers who are going to introduce themselves very shortly. I'll just go through a few housekeeping notes. We'll be hosting the session for the next 40 minutes or so. We'll then have a Q&A session towards the end. The floor is open for questions throughout the session. So please feel free to type your question as we go along. The session is recorded, like all our sessions have been, and it will be available on demand on the SF Bright Talk channel after the session has ended. So a quick look at the agenda for the session. We're going to go through introductions. So I've already introduced myself. Richard and Francesca are going to introduce themselves, and they'll be covering, Richard is going to cover the evolving threat landscape, whilst Francesca will cover mostly protecting against the supply chains, how we protect ourselves. And I'll be coming back towards the end on the SF approach and Q&A. Rich, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks Benoit. Hi everyone, thanks for joining. So hopefully a few people might have seen a webinar we did earlier in the week, which I talked about the need for maintaining operational resilience. And really excited to be back today because supply chain deliberately was one thing we didn't particularly touch on, but is absolutely core to maintaining resilience. So I've been at the ISF on the research team for 10 plus years, working on recently on things like protecting the crown jewels, how we protect our most valuable information assets. Also in varying guises on our threat horizon research, looking ahead every year. We look ahead a few years to try and work out what the upcoming threats are. But what isn't included here is a bit of work way back in the annals of time, 5 years pre-COVID, looking at supply chain insurance as well. So it's an area that I've kind of got a bit of a background to. So yeah, looking forward to talking through those threats today. Francesca, over to you.
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Francesca. I'm a senior analyst in the tools and applications team at the ISF, and I joined back in September 2021, so coming up to 5 years now. I'm currently the product owner of the supplier security tool, which helps organizations throughout the entire supplier management lifecycle with a particular focus on the point-in-time assessments, as well as the building a supplier repository. I'm also the product lead for Assure, which is a tool due for launch towards the end of this year, which goes in hand with the soon-to-be-launched IRM3 methodology, which provides both a qualitative and quantitative pathway to information risk assessments. I've also been involved in various other things at my time at the ISF, such as being the RSMS Deputy Manager for our ISO 27001 project, and have previously looked after the benchmark tool as well.
Great, thanks Francesca. We're going to come back to you shortly, I think, and yeah, get beyond the fear, uncertainty and doubt that I might start sowing and start thinking about how we can actually do something about it. So yeah, about that FUD, and that's not what we want everything to be about, but it's fairly obvious, and it has been for a long time, that supply chain security is absolutely critical to security in general, right? Attackers know that attacking a supplier is a good backdoor into many different organizations. So it's been a weak link for a long time. And you know, for a lot of people on the call, I probably don't need to run through this in detail, but just a few very high level incidents that have made global news, right? That have shown the impact that different types of supply chain incident can have. So chosen a few, and we could name many here, but these are all slightly different, but all very impactful. So if we think about what happened with SolarWinds back towards the end of 2020, you've kind of got one organization that was targeted via a an international ransomware gang who are able to compromise essentially thousands of different organizations through one single supplier. And there's also their kind of customers, and their customers were then affected. Kaseya was also a malicious attack. So Kaseya, as a software provider, was attacked by a malicious attacker, a hacking group, and their one piece of software that was used by, I think, 60 plus managed service providers essentially led to ransomware attacks on those 60 managed service providers, which had then an ongoing impact on their customers. And then what I wanted to point out slightly differently when we think about the CrowdStrike IT outage from a couple of years ago, that was actually a misconfiguration. So it was an accident. It wasn't any malicious meaning or intent behind this, but it equally shows that a misconfiguration, some kind of accidental incident at a major supplier, can have a huge impact downstream. So that, CrowdStrike misconfiguration led to 8.5 million Windows devices being affected. So I think the key thing we want to just get across here is if you hit one part of the supply chain, it can have a massive cascading effect downwind. So one or down throughout the chain. Hit one attacker or one supplier, and you can cause great damage for multiple different service providers, for their customers, for their organizations, and suppliers and partners. And when we think about what the world looks like and the threat landscape, which is what I'll move on to, we can see this is likely to become an ever increasing problem, more so than it is now, because when we look at the nation states involved and major cyber criminal organizations, they know they can have a big impact by targeting specific suppliers. When we do our threat horizon research, we try and look at what the future holds. So how will this landscape evolve over the next few years? It goes beyond supplier security, but obviously it's a big part. We identified 3 key themes that are all kind of interlinked. Looking ahead to 2028, thinking about how geopolitics is shifting, all those different interactions between different countries, different states and blocks. Also how the era, what does the era of AI mean? Is there going to be a boom or bust in the market? That all has a different kind of impact. What new capabilities is it bringing us? What new threats? And then how cybercrime itself is evolving into whether it's going to go into the way of very large criminal organizations, or is it going to become more diversified and lots of smaller groups. So when we think about geopolitics and what's driving supply chain threats in particular, one of the things we identified as more likely to happen over the next few years is just the likelihood that access to certain suppliers is going to be cut off, potentially by either war or conflict or new regulations that kind of cut off access to different markets. And that's obviously a pretty key thing. We're starting to hear, for instance, in Europe, more and more companies now starting and organizations wondering, okay, are there certain bits of American software that we could do without? Or what happens if we're suddenly not allowed to use that particular piece of software? So depending on where you operate, especially for multinational companies with operations across numerous different parts of the world, this is going to be a potentially big issue. It's going to require some redundancy or failover in terms of, are we able to actually keep our operations going using different suppliers? Are we able to move quite quickly? If we think about the AI-driven threats, there's a few different ones here related to supply chains. The first and foremost, when we think about vibe coding, if you're using any suppliers to provide any kind of applications or software or development for you, do you know how secure that code is? We're seeing more and more vibe coding here, which inherently brings in more vulnerabilities into code just because it's using public repositories. You don't know where the codes come from, how secure it is. But also, what if you're using algorithm services provided by AI providers? If those algorithms are poisoned, like deliberately manipulated or with bad data input, what does that mean for the outcomes, the services they run for you? Also, less on a technical side, we explored, okay, is the market going to boom or is there going to be a bust around AI? We've seen such great investment in data centers, but we also know that AI companies are currently losing money hand over fist. So is that bubble going to keep growing? Is it going to burst? We don't know, but if it does burst, just what happens when, if that happens, a lot of the smaller providers are likely to go out of business. So what happens if you've got AI companies responsible for core processes within your business, and they suddenly go bust, no longer exist? Again, similar to that lack of access to key suppliers, are you able to move quickly to replace those services? And cybercrime definitely linked to all of this, and you can see a few of those different types of attacks might have an impact on the supply chain. For instance, AI making it easier to find vulnerabilities, it means that your suppliers are going to face more and more attacks criminals will be able to identify more vulnerabilities to attack them. But specifically, we thought, what's a bit different? What might happen over the next few years? Well, we've seen it happen in a few different industries. But what happens if you get suppliers who look legitimate but actually turn out to be a front for a sophisticated crime group? We've seen it in, I think, the haulage industry and retail. We know some shops, some businesses literally look perfectly legitimate and probably do some legitimate activity, but are essentially a front for large criminal groups. Again, what would stop some of these large criminal groups setting up managed service providers, for instance? So yeah, have to look out for that. Do you know who you're doing business with? So yeah, we know supply chain is an evergreen, or supply chain threats are evergreen. They've been around forever. There's still, that threat is going to evolve over the next few years. It's still going to be there. So the key thing for us to understand is, what can we do about it from a security industry point of view? So I'm going to pass over to Francesca to start getting into the detail of that.
Thank you for setting the scene there, Rich. And I think you've perfectly illustrated how, with some of those headlines we started with at the start, how the discussions around supply chain threats are becoming more and more popular in terms of discussions happening all across the organisation, to the point now it's seen as a broad level issue and topic to discuss, even though the security teams are the ones kind of on the ground doing the day-to-day activities. From the organisations that I've spoken to, I think a lot of organisations are struggling to keep a pace with the changes that are happening with the threat landscape. But of the organisations that seem best prepared to protect themselves against these new and emerging supply chain threats are the ones that have really focused first on getting the basics right and enhancing their supplier management programme on top of that. Just keeping in mind some of those threats you've just discussed there, Rich, if we're looking at the topic of AI, where AI is becoming more and more mainstream, both within our organisations but in our supplier organisations, the biggest risk there when it comes to our suppliers is all of the unknowns. So if you're unaware of who your AI suppliers are, or for your existing suppliers who are starting to use AI across all of their business processes, are you aware of who they are and what they're doing? With those unknowns, there becomes a big vulnerability there if you can't really assess the risk. And if you don't know where the data is coming in from or flowing out to, that can cause a lot of issues. What I'm seeing a lot of organisations doing to address this is in their supplier questionnaires, they're asking very specific questions, asking suppliers to detail out their AI usage and how it impacts the data that they have on the organisation. And they're reinforcing this with the contractual agreements, making very explicit statements about what is and what not is acceptable, and having that documented all in the contracts. Taking a look at the geopolitical angle, I think in the last couple of years, we've really seen this kind of play out, whether it be with the Trump tariffs or the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and in Europe, where overnight suppliers and entire supply chains have kind of become not as viable as they used to be. And whilst this is an issue for supply chains more generally and not always a cyber-specific concern, it is kind of rippling across the entire supply chain network and is having an effect on supply chain teams. And I guess the first point here for supply chain teams to be aware of is identifying where those weaknesses could be, keeping an eye on the geopolitical landscape as it unfolds. And for some organisations, specifically for their most critical suppliers in terms of business operations, are looking to diversify, whether that be to have a few suppliers that they're using on an ongoing basis to deliver that product or service, or even just having a few suppliers in the back pocket to use in cases of emergency. As for the cybercrime angle, I'd say some organisations are always going to be a bit more vulnerable to the elements of cybercrime. It might be due to their location, their size, and their maturity. And so that's really important information for the security team to be aware of, and they can use that when it comes to prioritising which suppliers to focus on and which suppliers may need more support from their security team. But for all of these threats, the key part here is that continuous monitoring element. As all of these threats are continuously evolving, and as are our suppliers, that continuous monitoring element really helps to kind of keep on top of these changes and being able to respond much more quickly. We do have a range of ISF resources to help with all of these different challenges. All of the ISF materials in the supply chain space focus around the supplier management lifecycle. So we have each of our supply chain reports focusing in different parts of that. And the supplier security tool puts into practice how organizations can better manage their supplier management lifecycle from the very beginning, from when you're still searching for potential suppliers and writing down requirements, all through the onboarding process, the continuous monitoring up until the point of exit and termination. And so there's ISF materials to help organizations in each of these different components of the life cycle. As for practical steps of what organizations can do, from a lot of the organizations I've spoken to, the first step is to better their understanding of who their suppliers are. So many organizations have multiple different lists for their suppliers handled by different teams across the business or even just different business owners. And without this central repository of all of your suppliers, it's very difficult to assess the risk if you don't even know where the risk could be. And so for a lot of organizations, the first practical step is to consolidating all of these lists down into one singular location, which you can do in the supplier security tool, or there's other different methods as well. And start to begin to build out these supplier profiles. So it's not just about who your suppliers are, but getting to know their risk profile too. In order to do this process, there's a lot of work you can do yourself in terms of documenting the information that you know, engaging with the procurement teams or the business owners that work with that suppliers on a regular basis, and even engaging with the suppliers themselves to kind of fill in those gaps, whether it be just through general conversations or through sending out assessments, just to give you all the information that you need to be able to assess your suppliers appropriately. Once you've done that activity, though, of kind of gathering all of the information into one central location, the next job for the security teams is to look at potential weaknesses, and this is an ongoing effort that would need to be reviewed regularly. But with the information that we've collected during the central repository, you can start to look for trends or patterns or potential weak points, whether it be the location of the supplier, the maturity, even their suppliers, and to begin to build up this bigger picture. Some of these weaknesses might be really easy to spot straight away. Others may take taking a look at a wider picture set and identifying weaknesses across your entire supply chain rather than just looking at one particular supplier. And with all of these weaknesses, it's really useful to document these down so you can refer back to them in decisions you need to make later down the line. And of course, it's easiest to store this in that central repository. Once we've got that supplier list and we've identified where those vulnerabilities could be, an important step for security teams is to focus their efforts in the places where it matters most. And so by creating a tiering system for your suppliers is a particularly important step, so your efforts are where it can have the biggest impact, especially when security teams are quite stretched for resources and time. Focusing on those high-risk suppliers is a very useful activity. In the supplier security tool, we do offer a way to help organizations categorize their suppliers into different tiers by taking a look at the information sensitivity, the business impact, the supplier criticality, and the information sharing frequency to provide a suggested tier for your suppliers. There might be other factors that you'd want to take into consideration too, but the process here is just to kind of get a list of suppliers in this higher critical tier to start your efforts. And then you can start to tailor your program so that most of your efforts are focused on where the biggest risk could be. So it could be for your higher risk suppliers that you send more granular assessments. You might have regular check-in points and even start to supplement it with some continuous monitoring capabilities too, just so those the behavior of the security team is acting in accordance with the risk level. I'm now going to pass you on to Benoit to cover off some of those other elements as well.
Thanks, Francesca. And this is where I can use my previous knowledge on supply chain and combine it with the SOGP, as you can see on the screen. But if we talk about contractual agreements, it's there's a couple of things to bear in mind. Really, it's one big caveat is that contractual agreements are primarily driven by legal teams, procurement teams. Cybersecurity is only one portion. It has become extremely important over the last years, that cybersecurity articulates the necessary clauses that should be added into contracts. But nevertheless, it's still, at the end of the day, a contractual agreement that should be reviewed with legal expertise and procurement teams. The reason why I'm saying that is that what you see on this slide and what we offer as guide, it can only be used as guidance. And so you see here on this slide, for example, a couple of examples that we find in the SOGP and the research as well on supply chain. But the simple way of looking at it, if you want to have an indication of what should I put in my contractual clauses when it comes purely to cybersecurity, you can open up the standard good practice and head straight to the topic. There's a whole topic on this supplier contracts, SC13, and you'll see some more details around what you see on this slide. So typically, for example, let's start with acceptable use of AI. We talked about this a little bit earlier on already. So you should make sure that your supplier, and it's stated in your contract that your supplier has some form of policies on the usage of AI, and they inform you, really, the suppliers inform you on how much they use AI, and they have the right policies in place and procedures internally. Reporting requirements for cyber attacks. So that's not just cyber attacks, by the way, it's any significant incidents from your supplier side should be reported back to you as main organization. Acquiring the contracts, meeting applicable legal regulatory requirements. That's again on the supplier side. So you want to make sure that the supplier is also aware of their legal requirements, obligations. Level of support in case of incidents, very important to be able to access your suppliers' systems or resources and teams if there's a major incident that is happening either at your supplier or that affect your supplier from your organization's side. The last one can be a little bit controversial, is often discussed, right to audit. If you can, it's always a good practice to put this in a contract, but not every supplier will agree to that, and rightly so. And typically, the larger and the more significant the supplier is, if it's a large cloud provider, the more leverage they will have on refusing you to get the right to audit. But they will still give you some elements of certification or knowledge of how they handle security in their organization. So again, if you want to find out more about some typical clauses that you should be considering, and again with a big caveat to agree and review with your legal teams, you can head to the standard good practice for that. Next, we want to talk a little bit about resilience and how what Francesca mentioned a bit earlier on as well. It's good to diversify your critical suppliers to build resilience. It's also important to understand this as within reason, right? You don't want to over diversify because then it becomes clearly unmanageable. And so you want the right level of diversification. What is key really here is to understand the level of criticality of your suppliers, which, by the way, is not the same as the potential business impact. It can be quite similar, but it's not necessarily the same. Yeah, criticality being, how much you can operate your business with or without the supplier. So the more critical and the more you will want your supplier, the more the supplier, your business relies on this on the supplier, the more critical they will be. So in that case, what shows on this slide is that you should what we would say is that you have to have several providers. It's good practice to have a strong provider, for example, again for cloud, and then a sort of backup provider or secondary provider that is ready also to help you and support you if you need to switch suppliers. Same for security tooling, same for identity access management. Again, identity access management, you don't necessarily want to diversify too much, but you want to have at least a couple of options if your main provider of identity has a main issue. So this is what this slide is saying, and of course, so key message here is really trying to assess, be in a good position that you understand the level of criticality of your suppliers, and have in your inventory of suppliers this level clearly flagged, clearly identified, and know where to go next if your supplier is affected, if this critical supplier was to have a breach or an incident. Where could you go? How could you resolve this? Or where would you go next? Which supplier would you go next?